All right, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Welcome to the second YPI Leadership Lab event. Leadership Labs is a new flagship event series for young professionals in infrastructure that's going to consist of fireside chats between an emerging and senior leader in the infrastructure space. Because even though infrastructure's been around a long time, the infrastructure industry as we know it today has been something that's only been around for a short time. It's really interesting to get these lessons of how leaders built their career since everyone has a unique path and no one really necessarily works a lot of the jobs we work now. So it's really cool to see how someone went from just learning about the space to being someone who, you know, every state in the country would call upon for good advice now. And if you're looking ahead, we've got an exciting lineup of leadership labs ahead. We're going to have one more this year in New York City, hosted by WSP, as well as one focused on insurance in Chicago and one focused on a developer in Miami coming up. So be on the lookout for those. More information will be posted on our social media sites, and look out for other future events coming up in New York City throughout the fall. For the event today, we're kind of starting a bit behind schedule, but Tom and Mark are going to talk for about 40 minutes, followed by questions, and then we're going to be able to have a reception around here. And now to introduce our two speakers. Tom Rousakis is a Senior Managing Director and U.S. Infrastructure Leader with Ernst & Young Infrastructure Advisors. Tom brings decades of experience in U.S. infrastructure and is a recognized authority in infrastructure finance and the U.S. public-private partnership market. And Marco is a director with EY Parthenon's infrastructure practice. He advises clients on procurement, commercial structuring, and operational improvements. Marco's experience spans freight, tolling, transit, and electric vehicles. And Marco is also the Vice President of Professional Development for Young Professionals in Infrastructure. So thank you very much for being here today, and we're excited to have our talk.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you, Tom, for accepting to share your career journey with us. So let's just get started. I imagine as a little kid, you were thinking, I need to work in infrastructure, right? That's how you were waking up every day, but maybe not. And so tell us a little bit about what you studied in college, and then what were your first jobs coming out of college before infrastructure was even a thing in your mind?
Yeah, let's go way back. First of all, thanks everyone for coming. This is really exciting, and love to sort of share my journey, which is unique, and as mentioned a second ago, right? Everyone has their journey, everyone has their pocket, their niche in this market. Hopefully, I could help you all think about what your journey could be and look like going forward. It is a fairly nascent market here in the U.S. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for young people to continue to grow it, grow the way we look at infrastructure in the U.S. And so I'll go back before college, if that's okay. So I grew up with this very early age, wanted to be an architect. And so, real estate and buildings and so on and so forth. I had a big thing of Frank Lloyd Wright drawings. I used to go through on a daily basis and so on and so forth. So I love the built environment. I grew up in the New York area, so highways and buildings and sort of the interaction of infrastructure and people and how it shaped behaviors was very much a thing that I felt, very viscerally. I've also always, maybe just in my household, had a very an interest in government and the public sector, right? And that was, our conversations were about politics and, international affairs and so on and so forth, and around the kitchen table. And so, and the functioning of government was very important, in our household. And so, those are sort of, down deep, the things that, that inspired me and I was around as a child. Incredibly though, by the time I got to senior in high school, so I grew up in the 1980s, and there was something called the Cold War back then. You may have heard of it. And so, and so when I went off to college, I thought it wouldn't be really interesting, because again, with the government lens, but to play a role in international relations, diplomacy. So I'm going to end the Cold War. And so I became a Russian and Soviet studies major, because I was going to learn everything about the Soviet Union, and I was going to be you know, and I wasn't going to be the ugly American, and we were going to find detente and so on and so forth. Well, I graduated and the Cold War was over. So neither I saw it. They saw me coming, right? And so I needed to pivot. And likewise, actually, you know, I think, you know, it's it was also really important for me to think, and I spent some time abroad and really think about like what's actually important to me. And really, you know, I sort of came back from that saying, you know, if you're really going to have an impact on the world, you know, there's real value to thinking more locally, right? Where can you really have a tremendous impact on your city, your state, your country, so on and so forth. And so I actually ended up pivoting into local government. And my first job out of college, and this is important as well, right? And my first job out of college is I worked for the city of New York for an agency that investigated corruption in the school system. And the school system was very different here in New York. There was actually 32 community boards. 32 school boards with lots of buying power and electoral power. And so what we would do is go into the system and find, you know, the corruption that the system was creating. So, a misalignment of incentives and processes that sort of, you know, drove either political corruption or actual corruption, so on and so forth. And we wrote reports about it and really led to the change in the way that the governance of New York City schools operates today. I didn't want to be a lawyer or investigator. We did a lot of that. Stakeouts are fun, but it's and going undercover, but that wasn't necessary for me. So I went back to grad school, went to the Kennedy School, and focused on housing, urban development, and transportation there. Interestingly, you know, with this lens of government improvement, right? There was also a book in the 1990s called Reinventing Government. It was, you know, it was big at the time for us, you know, policy geeks. And it was all about how do you actually, a lot of it's around how do you leverage the private sector in order to deliver public services more effectively. So that's another sort of, sort of strain in what influenced me. And so, you know, I did I was looking into city management. I was also looking into, you know, infrastructure and transportation. I had a great transportation professor in grad school, transportation policy professor. So that was definitely a focus area for me. And so, you know, so coming out of grad school, I actually managed to, it was fun. I spent the summer at the San Francisco mayor's office investigating, negotiating with the Giants for the new ballpark, right? So, wow, that's really interesting. You know, what does it take to actually have to put these big deals together? But also just sort of what's interesting is what I found was sort of less of an understanding on the public side as to how project financing happens. Like where does all the money come to make a project like that? That was a privately financed ballpark, first one in the country. And so coming out of that, I was actually able to secure a position. I was looking into various things, but public finance was one of those areas. And so I started my true infrastructure career going back in 1997 in public finance at one of the big investment banks, where I started out as a generalist, but then they decided they wanted to build a transportation practice. I raised my hand, and so I helped build the transportation practice there. At that point in time, none of what we're talking about here existed, right? The infrastructure world in the US was bankers, bond financial advisors, and engineers. And the engineer side of the house and the finance side of the house never came together, right? And in the summer session, we have this amazing municipal finance system here in the US where nowhere else in the world do municipalities have access to capital. As a result of that, not combining sort of thinking about capital and the projects together, it leads to potentially, incentives to not focus enough on projects, right? And so, I would talk to all of my, CFO clients, and they were just risk takers, right? It's like, oh, the project went over budget, the project went over budget. We have access to the markets, we're just going to keep borrowing. And that maybe not, let's restructure, especially in transit space. There's a concept of scoop and toss, very technical. You take your debt service this year and you finance it long. right? Just to get out of an operating budget and get through things. And so that really made an impact. And I also always had a real interest in transit. I spent a lot of time in the transit space as a banker. And also in project finance. So that's also where I learned project finance. No one taught me I had to learn how to do Excel on my own. No, none of that, period. I literally learned it on my own. Because we used all sorts of bond sizing programs, right? We didn't do a lot of that stuff. So yeah. So
let's talk a little bit about that, because that's super interesting. It sounds like you went to investment banking at a time when there was a nascent and free market. Maybe you can tell us what you were seeing from that perspective. And then also maybe can you tell us a bit on a personal professional level, what were the skills, like you mentioned, you learned, how to use Excel, but like what were all the technical skills that you learned in that position that you still then carried forward for years and years?
Yeah, I mean, it's for me, I think as you think about entering into the infrastructure world, right? We'll talk a little bit more about this. It's very important to understand sort of how you operate as a person and so on and so forth. I really like the idea of having a basketball and really understanding the finance elements of the infrastructure world. So what does it take to raise capital? And then that next level, project financing, right? How do you build a credit story in order to get a project finance that's on the cusp of investment grade or not investment grade? I also spend a lot of time, with clients and a piece of advice as well. I, from day one, always treated my clients as my own business, right? I took it very personally. I developed relationships with my clients. Maybe it comes from my parents were small business owners, right? Or something of the sort, but I was able to develop relationships with clients who then became mentors of me and supporters of me over time. Right. So as they moved up and they had opportunities, they created opportunities for me as well. So we spent a lot of time in banking doing pitching, right? And so almost every day, yes, even if I was an associate, every day there'd be something I had to get a memo out to a client, change in the market, refinancing opportunity. Here's what we're seeing coming out of the federal government, so on and so forth. So that is actually something in the sort of that fast-paced environment of banking and very competitive market as well. That I leverage to that day, right? Being a good client server, being in front of clients, always having to bring a new idea to clients, to stay in front of them and help them solve their hardest problems, right? So it's this combination of understanding finance very deeply, but also being a good advisor and a trusted advisor to your clients. And thinking clients constantly, right? Waking up and thinking about the problems and how you're going to
Is
solve
there a
them.
specific client that comes to mind from those days, like a project or something that you're working on that has taught you a lot?
Lots of them. Well, let's go on, right? Because I think some of that is
So it sounds like you already were sort of in the mindset of like advisor, like you're talking about clients already in that sense.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about how you transitioned from banking to what we now call your financial advisory?
Well,
and sort of coming to EY.
Yeah. So like I said, the world was just these little silos at that point in time. So at the time, right before I made a transition from one bank to another, I was going from Morgan Stanley to Goldman Sachs. There was interesting things happening in this market, right? And there were pockets of it happening. You look at SR91, had a French operator doing managed lanes. That was way ahead of its time, but didn't quite grab hold. Then there was the Chicago Skyway transaction, right, which was the first big concession of a public asset, and Goldman led that transaction for the city of Chicago. I remember I was at my previous firm. We were looking at this like, why would you ever do this? Public finance is the lowest, cheapest cost of capital. We can raise the most cost together. In fact, we supported a competing bidder on them, because there's a lot you can do in the U.S. municipal market that you couldn't do in other places. Bid comes in like, we're missing something here. Right? I actually even remember one of our corporate bankers saying, we have some Australians saying they want to buy the Brooklyn Bridge. Seriously, right? We're like, what are you talking about? This, right? So the things that are happening in Australia and Canada and the UK for various reasons, we're starting to bubble into the US, right? So fast forward, I had the opportunity to go to Goldman at that point in time to help grow that transportation practice. And all of a sudden, you find yourself in a position where, wow, banking around infrastructure just changed. That it's a lot more of an M&A mindset, and that you can actually be an advisor to a client to get an infrastructure project complete, but in a completely different way. Not through a bond issue, but through an actual procurement and a competitive procurement, and bringing some of the lessons that come from the corporate M&A market to the infrastructure market, and create this competition around equity and project delivery.
Right.
And I mean, you all probably realize this, right? The issue with the US is a highly devolved market. Decisions get made at a very local level. There's no way to centrally, require a way to go about infrastructure projects. And so it means that when new things come around, it's hard for them to really spread, right? You need to, it's word of mouth. It can take forever to happen. In some respects, it is still taking forever. But when you had a big smash like that got followed by the concessioning of the Indiana toll road, those are big splashes that open people's eyes to a different market. Now, not necessarily the selling, the concessioning of existing assets, right? Those, I think, for the most part, are still fairly politically challenging in this country. But then Texas DOT, Florida DOT, Virginia DOT started more and more using these tools for new build types of projects. And really seeing that money, what equity could bring to the table, opened this market's eyes, and since has been sort of building upon that for the last, I guess now, close to 20 years, 15 to 20 years. So going to your question.
Those splashes opened up the market of P3s, and on the side also financial advisory. And then you were at a moment in which you were thinking of transitioning. No, but before you go, there's already, you had a question around, projects for myself that had an impact, right? And so there were pockets of advisory firms out there, like, the EY acquired a boutique investment advisory firm called Jeffrey Parker Associates, was advising in Florida, right? And that's in New York and other places in Virginia. And so, there were these pockets out there. When we were at Goldman, we were doing some of the greenfield work as well. So, the project that I was always most proud of, I was a transit person. And I talked about, why a transit agency is so, challenged to actually deliver projects on time and on budget. And how do they actually manage their risk? Because, to the extent you manage risk, manage costs, you can provide more service at the end of the day. And so we had an opportunity from a very early stage to take from concept to contract, for our client at the time loves to use that term, on the Denver Eagle project at RTD. And so that's a project that, while everyone else was looking at toll roads and how to use P3s for toll roads and so on and so forth, I'm looking at where I'm saying, Mike, you do this in transit. How does this work? This concept of availability payments, right? And wow, that makes a lot of sense, because you can actually pay based upon performance over time. And so we sort of took that from concept through market soundings, through structuring, to bid, and ultimately successful bid for that project that attracted private capital, but also attracted federal capital through a pilot program in order to get that project done. And that was groundbreaking at the time. It's still the only operational transit. How long have you advised the client?
That was from 2008 to 2011. That was probably 3 years, and flying to Denver.
And still relationships with that, right?
And still a lot of work in the Colorado market. I think that's exactly right. So for me, that going back, right? Going back to, I came into this because I was interested in improving government processes and how we actually do these types of things. Dodd-Frank happens, right? Which then changes the relationship banks can have with municipal issuers and makes it more of an arm's length type of relationship. And so, the opportunities to do what, I worked on in Denver and Texas and other places, was shrinking from the banking side of things. And the other thing as well, I mean, I think in banking, it's exciting, a lot of great things, but you're sort of limited to the products you could do, right? And so EY acquires the JPA practice, and I had the opportunity then to, knowing them from the market, had the opportunity to join that practice a year later in 2013 as the second partner in that practice.
Is that an easy decision for you, just make that transition?
It's weird, right? All you know is banking. Like, can I be a consultant? What is that like? I had former colleagues who had made that transition ahead. So I sort of had a good understanding of what that was about. But what was sort of cool is the day I walked in, I'm like, I can do this, right? It's not that different. I bring some skill sets, but all of a sudden, clients are asking me to do things I couldn't possibly do because all I could do was sell bonds or sell them for free in the past, right? And so all of a sudden the sky's the limit.
And so maybe we could talk about, who were those early clients that when you joined EY, and what were the types of projects that you were working? What is the universe that expanded for you? You talked about your fastball, right? The capital raising. What came on top of that fastball? What did you build, and what experiences did you have?
Yeah. Listen, I mean, the practice that I was lucky enough to join was known in the market for innovation, right? And we still have that mindset now, which is we want to be the first, hopefully not the bleeding edge, but the edge of what I'd like to think about is taking these international precedents and applying them in the US context. And so, when we were first, doing this work, it was a lot of state DOT highway work, right? That was the bread and butter. And I was lucky. We came in, we were working on the Golf Falls Bridge P3, which was the first P3 here in the Northeast. We were advising the state on the replacement of the Tappan Zee Bridge project, right? Which was not a P3, but it was a project financing, and it was the first design build that New York had done as well. And so, that was really exciting. I mean, so that was really exciting. And so what we were able to do over time was to take this skill set, right? I mean, if you all know, right? I mean, there's certain elements to the project finance mindsets that can be applied in the P3 mindset that can apply in its component parts to any infrastructure asset class. Very early on, though, from my perspective, I was very fortunate. We were engaged because I had done some work around transit development. I'd helped structure the transaction for Denver Union Station in Denver when I was doing work there, and so we were hired to be the advisor to the state of New York on Moynihan Station, which is right across the street, right? And so we actually scrapped an old negotiation and reran a whole process to select the developer and develop the finance plan and execute the financing to get that project that had been on the books for at least a decade at that point in time, and to be able to work on a transformative project like that for New York, right? And it's not infrastructure equity; it's real estate developers, which is very different, right? And getting everything to align in that regard, when we had the benefit of this project having been thought about for quite some time, but to be able to run that process, get through a federal TIFIA loan process, deal with all sorts of uncertainty was really challenging, but really exciting and rewarding. And I get to walk through it every day on my way to work.
Thank you. That's all of us. So that you described sort of like the bread and butter, right, of what the practice did at the time, the DOT, the roads.
Yeah.
in the last, 10, 15 years, how have you seen the types of projects, the types of needs that those clients, maybe it's the same clients, but with different needs, change in the context of the market changing, which the infrastructure market has changed a decent amount? What are you working on today?
So you're right in that, we were able to take this skill set and apply it to other asset classes, right? So we do a lot in the campus energy space. We're doing much more work in the water space, right? Which is really exciting. We can talk more about that as well. We did the first, we advised on the first availability payment P3, infrastructure P3 in the higher education space with UC Merced. That's something that I worked on, right? We did we advised on the first, maybe globally first, resiliency P3 project in Fargo with the Fargo Moorhead P3 there. That is supposed to actually open this October to provide flood relief. When you pair these back, they're not that different, right? It is combining some of that muni credit understanding, right, that you bring to the table, and layering in the approach on P3 to make something ultimately financeable here in the US market, and helping to build a capital stack far more complex here in the US than P3s anywhere else in the country, or these types of projects anywhere else in the country, because we are braiding together, a half dozen at least sources of capital, in order to make these projects happen, which is exciting for me, right? And understanding credit, how, what investors need, what equity investors need, what private activity bond investors need, how federal grant programs work, right? How do you put all that stuff together is really fun and exciting. And I think a hallmark of what we do and why people seek us out, right? How do you cobble all these, how do you close that gap? So we've been very successful in expanding the types of asset classes in which we advise, which is exciting. But I think the other piece is really, yes, so we were very transaction focused early on, and my background is very much in transactions. I say personally, what I got out of, projects like the Eagle Project was, that's cool to get the project done. What I got out, most of it is watching the transformation of my actual clients and say, wow, we've never worked on something so interesting. We have never been in the same room, finance and engineering and planning and leadership in the same room talking about a project.
Just doing capital while you go through the
building organizational capacity, right? And that's sort of the beauty of the P3 model because it forces everyone in the room. But why can't we do that more broadly if it's not a P3, right? And so just thinking about what we try to do is think about, at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to solve our infrastructure clients' problems. We're trying to help them get from point A to point B in the most efficient manner and successfully deliver a project. That could be maybe a procurement approach or financing approach. It could also be organizational capacity. It could be technology implementation. It could be a whole, slew of potential ways that a firm like ours can help our clients ultimately be successful. And that's actually something that really excites me as I think about the future, right? It's not just that, okay, applying this tool in different sectors, but what are the range of tools, what are the range of challenges our clients are facing today? And they continue to get more and more complex. There is a huge gap, and you guys, just the opportunities for you guys was amazing, right? Because there's a huge gap between the needs and the capacity in this country for solving infrastructure problems. And so, we'd like to figure out the best way to, in that white space in between, have the greatest value and greatest impact on this one.
Right. It sounds like the capital became a tool, right, to solve a particular problem, but through that, there's skills that were learned that apply then tools that are not just capital, right?
Yeah.
Human capital tools and process tools. And technology now is a big topic. So maybe talking about topics of the future, I think you brought up water, and potentially a bit of energy, but are there particular areas of infrastructure asset class that excite you looking forward?
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
I think water is fascinating, right? We've had some really good successes in the space to date. you look at what's going on in the southeast, right? And anyone who tried to go skiing this year saw there was no snow in the mountains, which is only going to have ripple effects in a lot of the states that depend upon the Colorado River and other rivers. And so there is, I think, a sense of urgency to try to address those issues right now. So a lot of actually P3 opportunities popping up into that space, which I think is really exciting, right? It's really exciting to be able to. I mean, unfortunately, it takes crises in this country to get people really moving. But we have those capabilities, and we have those opportunities to help in those areas. I think continues to be some water, who knows, maybe in the nuclear space, right? Nuclear, no one does nuclear well, right? We don't have a track record doing that. Is that an opportunity as well? Everyone knows there's everything going on in data centers and the energy that comes along with data centers. That's a fascinating area as well. That we're all trying to figure out how to lean into and add value into that space. I was going to say something else.
That's all right. Always saying and there's a lot to
Come back to it for there.
I'm going to ask now for the reflective Tom to think and look back more on sort of, you went from being a trusted advisor to clients, right, at banks, and a trusted advisor, financial advisor at EY. And then as your career progressed, you also became the leader of a team, right? A team with more than 50 people, a lot of billions, under sort of consulting on billions of dollars of transactions. Can you tell us what that journey is from being like an excellent individual professional in some way to being a leader of people in a team?
Oh boy. Nothing prepares you for it. But it's exciting, right? It is exciting. I still love, and what gets me up in the morning is my client work, right? And thinking about my clients, but also thinking about then stepping back, right? If I can impact more clients, it will be through building a team that has the skill sets necessary to help them get there, right? And so, it is always a combination of nurturing the team and making sure the team has the right learning opportunities and experience opportunities such that they'll grow. It's also creating a direction, right? Where are we heading to the best of our abilities? It's a challenging market right? I try to live in the moment and understand what's available, what the opportunity is now. But providing that direction and a vision for what we could do in the future. But I also work in a very complex organization. And so a lot of these consulting firms are matrix organizations. I have probably 10 people I report to in various forms, and helping, yes, me too. Your life is simple. But it's helping our team navigate in a complex, large consulting organization that is constantly changing. It is advocating for our team within that organization and highlighting the impact we have not only on our communities around us, which is very important to the firm, but also within the firm, right? And how do we contribute to the overall image and teaming and growth opportunities for the overall firm. And so, it's how do you manage, if you think about leadership, it's what I was always taught. It's how do you manage up, how do you manage down, and how do you drive forward? And how do you bring all those people at the same time together to ultimately, at the end of the day, create opportunities for people like all of you in the room, right? To be able to be promoted and get to a point in your careers where, like me, you can go out and win business and be a trusted advisor to clients.
And so for making it practical for people in the room, I think you have given some practical advice, like hold the fastball, being curious in terms of what the market is doing and how it's evolving. Do you have any other practical advice for the audience?
Clearly it's not my life wasn't a straight line in that respect, right? I think very important is just understanding who you are and understanding how you work and, you know, and clearly well decided infrastructure, right? I'd always coach people like what gets you, at some point, something's going to be a job. So you want to make sure when you wake up in the morning, you're excited about ultimately what's at the end of it. And so understanding what gets you up in the morning is important, but then thinking about, okay, who am I as a person? What is my potential fastball? Where do I feel comfortable? But then also having a vision of what you want to be in the future, and then sort of how you then build a career that gets you ultimately there, right? So pivoting from one to the other, being open, being curious, you know, being willing to learn, being able to take some risks, I think is important. And, you know, again, sort of being a good client server and caring about your clients and those things eventually you sometimes might not see it. You're gonna have to, you know, you're gonna have to tack along the way. But ultimately, you know, if you have sort of a maybe not a hard and fast vision of what you want, but something that's sort of there, like that North Star, if you will, thank you. You know, you'll ultimately get there. And work-life balance, you gotta also think about that, right? What do you want your life to be like? And that's important, right? That's important. And so, you know, then how do you juggle all these things?
Last two very hard questions. The first one is there anything you would have done different in your career if you're thinking back?
Yeah, I mean, probably 50 million things. Tons of things, right? We always think about, you know, every day goes by, we can only do the best that we can. So, you know, shouldn't beat yourself up over those things. Just roll with it and you know, continue to be better. You know, I think in this infrastructure space, especially if you're dealing in the public-private infrastructure space, right? And we realize the infrastructure market now is bigger than that. Infrastructure investors are focused on the private sector as well, and there's a lot of just private infrastructure work happening. But I would say if you're interested in doing work in the public sector, one idea, you know, one thought that always goes through people's minds is, does it make sense to take a point in time and actually work for a public agency, right? To really understand what it takes to get a project done. Our clients very much appreciate if we empathize and understand how hard it is to do things differently within an organization. And starting from there as a starting point, is, you know, I mean, sometimes it's easier said than done. You know, pivoting public-private can be challenging. You're leaving the private market. Are you going to be relevant coming back or not? You know, it's, or vice versa, so on and so forth. I had a, you know, I was fortunate that I did start off my career in the public sector, and so had a good understanding, not necessarily in the infrastructure space, but had some credibility in that regard. But I did have a professor in grad school who was the former CFO of the MTA, who I was going to advise. I'm like, I'm thinking going into banking, and then I'm going to come back to the public sector, and you know, because I'm going to pick up these skills like you're not. You can say that now. He's still around.
You won that bet.
You won that bet. But it is something that I think it's something to think about, right? There's real value in this. You know, and the relationships and the perspective that you bring, having been on sort of both sides of the equation, can be very powerful.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. And so the last question I have for you is, Tom is a great advisor, not just to his clients, also to his teams on pop culture and things related to infrastructure. So thanks to Tom, I've read The Power Broker, which is not an easy task. So the last question for Tom is, what advice you have in terms of any books or podcasts or any pop culture related to infrastructure that people in the audience should be reading?
I'd love to hear if people in the audience have any ideas. There's so much good stuff out there, but I mean, so, you know, something like The Power Broker was something that actually, along that journey, very much, you know, sort of opened my eyes to the opportunities and the challenges and so on and so forth. And growing up in New York, understanding why that highway went by my house, you know, 2 blocks away from my house and so on and so forth I mean, I think it is essential reading for anyone who wants to be in infrastructure. And it's just a great read. It's huge. we had the team recently listen. I actually had a client who had his team listen to the recent Big Dig podcast. Really fascinating stuff. And I think if I think about what I want our team to be doing, it is solving the problems that came up in that podcast, right? And really and really thinking about all the things that could potentially go wrong and try to help our clients manage risks around the project of that size. And so I thought that was wonderful listening. I think not directly on point to what I do on a daily basis, but I think anyone's interested in urban development and development in general, I'm going to actually recommend two things at the same time, because there's sort of a pairing and there's a big dialogue going on right now. One very influential book for me at a very early age was Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, right? And, and it takes as an example the West Village and, and the vibrancy of spaces, and anyone's interested in urban planning and architecture, you really, it's a very inspiring book. And in fact, books like that and Jane Jacobs really put an end to sort of the abuses of Robert Moses and the power broker. Well, let's fast forward now and we read, and I recommend people read the, abundance books that are out now, the abundance book in particular, or listen to the Ezra Klein podcast and so on and so forth. There's a real relitigation of that going on right now, right? Because especially if we look at housing, the cost of housing, and all of these cities that impose such strict zoning restrictions have led to a scarcity of housing and an increase in housing costs. And I think, and in sort of the environmental review processes, the review process that started in the 1970s as a result of some of the reaction to what happened, to that. There's a real dialogue going on right now and revisiting it. What is the right balance we're going to find in terms of protecting people's interests, developing projects that actually serve communities, not break them up, so on and so forth. But at the same time, how do we actually get more projects in the ground more quickly, reduce inflationary costs, reduce these burdens, reduce political exposure, because we all know the longer project takes to get off the ground, it's, less chance of actually going to happen, right? And so, the political cycle, the political risk, and all of that. And so, I would just say it just feels like we're at the beginning of a really interesting dialogue in this country around what's the right balance between those things. And it's just, where it comes out and what role we can play in that. It was just I'm really curious and interested and looking forward to helping our clients tackle it.
Great. Let's do that. We got some questions. See if anybody.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks again. I'm Sam for the advice and for your career journey. It's so interesting. I have a question. I would like two different answers. One a humorous answer and one a serious answer. So the question is the California high-speed rail project safe? First humorous.
Savable from who? Any perspective. Oh, serious. Oh, man. I don't focus on it day to day.
Fair enough.
And so I hear what you all hear in the news. There is a really good argument for that project happening, right? And if it does happen, though painful it will be when people, once projects get going and people forget what it took to get there, they're like, how do we live with that type of thing? That happens in projects and all types of projects. And so, it's a lot of money. And so I think California's have to figure that out. And the other piece of that is, I think you look at the history is, a lot of folks point to the alignment as being one of the issues, and that they actually made it in a straight line, would have been a lot cheaper right away, so on and so forth. On the flip side, they had an approach that was sort of economic development minded, that went through the Central Valley, went through cities in the Central Valley, could it be an economic development tool? So time will tell on that front. And, and if that is sort of still an important priority for the state of California, then it's worth investing into that project.
Thanks.
All right, Jack, well, my name's Jack, but when you're thinking about bringing P3s into a new market, it can kind of be difficult to already teach agencies where there's a track record of P3s in the space about doing P3s. When you were starting up something like this watershed P3 project, what was the process of even convincing them to start thinking about it?
Agencies here, actually. Because they're not the track record of failure. I think it's just getting to the fundamentals and demystifying, right? It is all about, I really think about, I love the term, especially if you think about availability payments, which, aren't happening as much right now in the US, but it's a performance-based contract. It's actually not that exotic and radical. The idea of a contractor putting at risk their capital for the long-term performance of an asset. There are clients out there that dream of that, right? They didn't know they actually had that toolbox. When you sort of walk through it and how it works and so on and so forth, I'm like, this is really cool. This has actually achieved so many different goals that we had in the first place. And at the end of the day, it takes so much of the burden off the bus, and now has a party out there that is focused on and align public policy goals with the private investment goals as well. I think some of the things, though, I have to say is, that some of the projects have benefited from is, and this sort of goes to federal policy, right? And I've argued this, if the federal government wants to spur more P3 projects, it's what incentives are you putting out there? The fact of the matter is the Eagle project, was part of a pilot program at the time for transit to prove out this model. And it led to their receipt of a very large federal grant in order to get that project done. And so there was a little bit of, this is cool, it was a lot of work. Oh, let's do it because we're going to get money, right? So yes, there is institutional resistance to doing things. And I was saying the project in Fargo as well benefited from a federal participation perspective. The Army Corps of Engineers, dedicated a lot, and it's not a big metropolitan area, right? Fargo, North Dakota, that because they're willing to actually take this approach, it actually helped them secure federal funding. I think it takes, I think it makes a lot of sense. There is institutional inertia. People don't like taking risks. If you can demonstrate that it's actually it's a question of, will this project get funded or not? It helps our clients get over that moment.
Hi, George Gogliaris, ING Capital. When you were a banker, Tom, at Goldman and Morgan Stanley, and you were financing an infrastructure project, how did you sell that story to credit risk? What troubles or challenges did you run into conveying the value of an infrastructure project to a risk group that maybe just didn't get it, and just how did you navigate that?
Well, I think our firms, this is all new to the firms as well. So, it's just internally, when we weren't providing our credit, we were helping our clients secure that credit. There were a lot of challenges early on, right? Because what we were doing was marrying a municipal market with an international project finance market. And let's take, for example, the concept of appropriation risk, and one of those sort of municipal market. That was very risky 20, 30 years ago in the municipal market. Now it's just assumed to work. That doesn't necessarily mean an equity investor or a project finance investor is going to accept the idea of appropriation risk, not actually having a secure payment. These things don't exist in the rest of the world. They don't have to deal with these things. So I have to say it's a matter of, a lot of it is, explaining the precedent in the municipal market. They may or may not care, right? Creating a competitive environment where, they had to choose whether or not they wanted to participate or not, which is helpful as well. takes a lot of hand holding and pointing to the precedent in the market, another market, and really saying, oh, that's not very different from that. It's just in a different form. We have to do that for quite some time. And then you look at managed lanes, right? And how investors look at managed lanes. Very lucky for the US. The US municipal market is very deep and has a long history. So there was actually an investor base that took the time to understand toll risk. They've been buying toll bonds for years. But express lanes, managed lanes, that's a new concept. No one knew how that was actually going to pan out at the end of the day. They're much more comfortable today than they were when TxDOT was trying to do, when Cintra was trying to do the early TxDOT deals. And then now you're seeing them perform even during the COVID crisis, right? So that gets to then higher ability to leverage and so on and so forth, tighter spreads, so on and so forth. But we actually had to, some situations really back off on what we knew was financeable, but the market, when we knew, just wouldn't accept it and provide more sort of bells and whistles to secure credits in the market. And eventually over time, things didn't fall apart. Projects got done. Oh, okay.
I think you spoke earlier about just how far the US P3 market has come, from the beginning of your career. Nowadays, how would you compare it to some of the more progressive industry countries like Australia? And what do you think the next steps are to continue that progression of the P3 market in the US?
Let me be clear. P3 market in the US is still a backwater. It's the Wild West. People think that we're like a developing nation in that regard. I mean, people internationally, that's their view, right? It is not where the rest of the world thinks it should be. It is fractured. It is, every agency has different, depending on your law firm, has different concession terms, a different approach, local political risks, so on and so forth. We are not there. Right, we're having a little bit of boom right now in terms of managed lanes transactions, so that's really exciting. It's taking some time to get there, but for the scale of the infrastructure needs in this country relative to the number of deals, it pales in comparison. The processes are still not where they should be in terms of the discipline of developing value for money and business cases and standardized documents and so on and so forth. We'd like to think we do a good deal, but it is hard for entrants in the market to really, you have to be here and understand the local market to get that done. So it has grown because of the fractured nature. It makes it hard to really grow, right? You get a new mayor, you get a new director, they don't want to do it, so on and so forth. You're starting from scratch. Maybe the federal government, there's talk of, federal government using new tools to sort of encourage the use of P3s. Maybe that has an impact. You get to see something that actually is really impactful, ultimately at the state and local level. So it's a tool in the toolbox. The market has evolved. And the other pieces, right? The market, a lot of contractors, the risk appetite over the last few years has reduced, right? What we thought we can get done in the P3 market, you can't get done necessarily in today's market. Contractors have been burned. Even in design build contracts, they've taken on too much risk. So there's a real, I think, a recalibration going on in the market between the allocation of risks. And then at that point in time, then does a P3 set make sense or not? Are you actually getting value for money and really truly getting, being able to transfer risk that's worth paying for in the market? So, we're in a constantly moving market. It's interesting, but there are more ways to get projects done, more innovative ways to get projects done than just P3s.
Let's do last couple questions. I'm Jack Nolan with Alvarez and Marcel. I've seen a lot of talk lately of private credit. Can you talk about how that's affecting the infrastructure market and what sort of impact that could have?
I answered this question recently, and I have to say this is not something I've researched. So I'll answer it how it passes. We haven't seen the impact in our world, right, of private credit. There are very deep capital markets that's in the US. That is one element of the capital markets. by definition, infrastructure assets, infrastructure investments are actually lower, lower yielding, more stable type of assets. And so, you look at the pension funds and so on and so forth that invest in the infrastructure space. In general, as a concept, volatility issues in other markets should bring more capital to infrastructure because it's viewed as more stable investments. And so, and likewise, there's, at least in the space that we focus on, and, I can't speak to data centers and so on and so forth, but there seems to be more than enough capital out there to get projects done.
Okay, last question.
Going back to the question about high-velocity mountain Elvis power, regarding the lack of kind of the P3 market transactions in the US, can the fact that there's a deep municipal bond market or municipal debt market that you mentioned earlier, can that be a reason why kind of the P3 market has lagged relative to international?
I mean, we all probably here, if you're looking at P3s, you're sort of a purist. Here's the value of what P3s bring. A lot of P3s that happen globally, especially sort of that created this market, a lot of it happened for access to capital reasons and accounting reasons, right? And sort of the EU and sort of off-balance sheet treatment of assets, and the fact that they didn't have a municipal market. So I talk to my colleagues across the globe, and they say, "Oh, we did a P3 because they brought the financing." Like, we don't have that problem here. We can bring our own financing. And so I think in some respects, I view, the international experience as more of a finance experience, then figured out the risk transfer portion of it and sort of the project finance elements of it. Whereas we're coming at it from a more purist perspective. We have access to capital. And so does a P3 make sense because it's the better way to deliver a project, not necessarily a new source of capital. That being said, equity capital is a very new thing to the US, and what we see on Express, revenue generating P3s, revenue will be revenue, but if you want to advance a project today, access to that capital is very important. We've seen that play out in various places.
With that, another round of applause.